seems to be for the last year or so, no matter what video I put out, I will get about 100 comments saying, "Why didn't you test Linux?" And nothing goes to prove this more than an old Alienware I bought, where most people were saying it'll perform better if I install Linux. Well, after multiple years of people asking, we're finally going to be testing out some of these systems on Linux. And what better one to start with than the cheap Alienware gaming PC, where 90% of the comments about operating systems was, "This will work better on Linux." And admittedly, my knowledge is quite out of date. We did actually used to test on Linux, and it used to be slightly better than Windows, slightly worse, depending what you wanted to test. But with how much everything is changing recently, why don't we actually take the time to find out if this can actually run better on Linux? And the operating system everyone was asking me to use was Bazzite. So I'm downloading a copy now, and apparently this will make my computer 50 times better. Maybe not 50 times, but everyone's been saying this will transform the computer, and I am a little bit skeptical. I am just a tad skeptical. So while that's downloading, why don't we put an SSD in this, because I did take the SSD out of this, and I'm going to talk through a couple of my thoughts on the matter just before we go into it. See, I'm not opposed to testing Linux in any way. I think it's a great idea. We used to test every computer on the channel with a Linux test, and we used to compare against at least about 3 operating systems. But back in the day, that was a lot easier because games were a lot easier to benchmark, and everything just sort of was lighter. Games were smaller, it didn't take me as long to download everything, and my internet's worse now than it was years ago. A lot of these older bits of hardware that I get into tests, usually I do decide the best operating system, or we test the most modern operating system depending on what it is. But it doesn't matter what I'm testing. It can be the 20p Dell Optiplex, and someone will say, "This will be better on Linux." It doesn't matter if I'm testing this cheap Alienware. Someone will say it'll be better on Linux. So the only way to actually find out is we're going to have to do a little bit of testing, and maybe this will be a little bit of a mini-series going through and testing all these bits. But needless to say, I am a little bit skeptical, because performance here was fine. It wasn't exactly amazing, but we were very graphics card limited. As a computer, it was quick enough. Admittedly, it was running the IoT version of Windows 11, which is a heavily cut down version. From my testing back in the day, there usually tended to be a very negligible difference when testing on Linux. It was usually just the source games that worked better. But with the new DirectX Vulkan stuff, all the combinations that it works in, we will give it a test. And I'm going in completely blind, I have no idea what I'm doing, and it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. But you know what? I ran my first computer on Linux, mostly because the only thing I had to run it off was a USB stick. This isn't exactly modern hardware, and a lot of the times my gripes when I get these comments is because people are commenting on things that don't support Vulkan, so they're very limited. They're ancient hardware that's got no support on modern Windows, yet alone on modern Linux. But yes, this is just going to be a little bit of a fun experiment, and luckily I've got the numbers to compare to on Windows 11, and we will get the figures to compare to over on Linux. But really, I think I could see this being the ideal age of hardware that would receive some sort of benefit, because admittedly we've got a Maxwell graphics card, we've got a Haswell Core i3, we've got 16 gigs of RAM, and we have an SSD. Let us now find out what happens, and if we can actually install Linux on here. I mean, it's not exactly like Windows is amazing these days, and there's so much bloat on there, but that's why I always use the most unbloated versions, because I want to get it as completely back to basics as possible. It's why my own computer runs the IoT version. And most computers, I've done the testing between different versions of Windows, and there's very little performance difference between testing Windows 11, usually back to Windows 7 to be honest. A lot of the time it is just a case of things are quite intensive, and sometimes old hardware's just not up to it. But it does seem like a lot of people, sometimes people that aren't even running Linux, have got this idea in their heads that it is just the ultimate fix and solution for everything. And I get it, for running a basic computer, sometimes it will be a lot quicker than Windows. In some cases, the computer hardware is more limited by the fact it's old than by what operating system you're running, because for most day-to-day tasks, as we've seen, well, even a Core 2 Duo with an SSD will get you by on Windows. It'll probably be quicker on Linux, but everyone's saying for performance, for applications, for programs, this is the best idea. So let's whack Linux on here, I suppose. Not that this serves as anything other than a refresher, but in terms of actual use on Windows, well, it was fine. As you can see here, even though we're on an old Core i3, it's not slow. It works fine, we've got up-to-date drivers, everything's installed and working. You can even run a stress test on the processor and carry on about your day, opening up applications, getting things to work. You know, it's not a bad experience here. So I'd rank the Windows experience here pretty good. I don't know why, I'm just a little bit skeptical of that claim, because it seems a little bit optimistic. I can understand it on modern hardware with DXVK and all of these fancy new ways of gaming on Linux that it could perform better. Is it the solution here? And that is a genuine question. That's not trying to complain about Linux in any fashion. It's just a case of, I genuinely don't know. So we're going to find out together if it actually serves as a decent solution. It is done and it is ready. We now have the Bazzite, I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it, install files. Turn this on. Oh, right, we actually get an install. So, United Kingdom, continue. This is actually going to be quite simple and nice to do. It's speedy. I mean, at least it's a nice installer, I can say that much about it. So now I suppose we just let this run, carry on, and then eventually, once it's installed, we use this installation. Now, I did have to pick which version I wanted, and this does actually have a Maxwell-based graphics card in it, which means it should still run the latest NVIDIA installation. At least the one of the desktop, not the game-ready one or whatever it's called. So we'll let this run through, and then hopefully we should be all good to run this on the PC. This is a good screen. That screen is gone. Oh, I believe we are actually working. So we are here at the desktop. So Steam is going to install, but this is pleasant. This is nicer than the old distros we used to have to run on bad computers. But none of this being nice matters. Windows 11 works fine as a desktop. The main thing we want to know is the actual performance difference. A Core i3 4150, 16 gigs of RAM, it's recognised our GTX 745, it's even recognised our Intel HD 4400, which I wasn't expecting at all. So I suppose we now just open Steam, and then we set up a few performance monitoring bits. I mean, we can't use any fraps here. And then we see if the performance is better. Maybe people are right. So I did have to restart the computer just to get Steam working, which really didn't take too long at all. Can we try and run something we know should work? I mean, let's go with the most basic test there is. Can you launch Half-Life 2? Well, I've heard the processor ramp up, so we could be here just a little while. Well, it took about 20 minutes, but we're in game. The green blob is gone. Let's just go in here, video settings, make sure everything's on its highest. But that should be pretty good. I mean, I'm amazed it's been so easy to get things this far. You know, someone just using it completely out of the box and following on-the-screen instructions. It's a lot easier than it used to be. Not that it was actually too difficult before, but, you know, it sounds more complicated than it really is. Well, this is also the weakest card that is supported on Bazzite, to be fair. Is the lag clearing up a little bit now? It does seem like the lag is clearing up a little bit. It's almost like some of the issues you have on some GCN cards, where in the first few minutes of gameplay, it's just stuttering. But we'll play through a little bit more, double check this is actually working, but as far as I can see it, that seems to have cleared up. The lag has gone by itself. There we go, we've done a quick test, and it does seem like everything is all set up and ready for testing. So why don't we carry on with the rest of the video and see if this is actually a good idea. So with all of that set up and out of the way, all that really matters is what kind of performance do we actually get. Now, if anyone wants a reminder on the specifications of this exact machine, it was a cheap Alienware X51 R2 that we picked up not too long ago off eBay. It was quite a good deal given the form factor of these machines and what they actually sell for, but inside the specifications really aren't anything amazing. We've got a Haswell Core i3, which is 2 cores and 4 threads, and we have a Maxwell-based GTX 745, which is really the lowest end version of the Maxwell range, so think about the 750 Ti if they cut it down and gave it DDR3. We do at least have 16GB of DDR3 RAM actually included as system RAM, and over on Windows we had a fairly decent time. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was very much in line with how I'd imagine the specifications would perform. Now, I've done as much research, as much tweaking, and as much optimization as possible to make sure the benchmarks are running the best they should. But before we go into these, please do just remember for some of the people here that were claiming that Linux will always perform better, that this this is an older system using an Nvidia graphics card, so those of you that know Linux will know that their drivers, well, they aren't always the best over on the Linux side, and when it comes to architectural support for Vulkan, well, this thing pales in comparison to even AMD's 10-year-old GCN range. So I was already a little bit dubious, but the only real way to find out if we do actually get any real performance improvement is in the Linux benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which was running with the same settings we used on Windows, this time with normal settings and HBAO enabled in the 720p resolution. It's also probably worth me noting here that I did spend quite a lot of time tweaking around outside the game, not just to get it working, but also to try and get the most stable experience I could possible, and this is what resulted. So 24 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 10 FPS. Now, it was controllable at least, but there were certainly frame drops in places, and when compared to the Windows side of things, where we were seeing anywhere from 50 to 60 FPS with lows down to 45 FPS, well, it certainly wasn't a great start for running things on Linux. Then again, this is a DirectX 12 game that is then being converted back to Vulkan, which is something that these older graphics cards don't deal with particularly well, and that overhead is of course being dealt with on an old dual-core i3. So starting things off, not fantastic. When moving across the legacy version of the game though, we did run the game with medium and high settings and Nvidia PC SS shadows in the 720p resolution. Now we saw around 30 FPS on average, which was certainly a lot more playable than the Enhanced Edition, and the stutters weren't anywhere near as bad with 1% lows down to 18 FPS. Now this is by no means a spectacular result, but it is admittedly one that was at least considered almost playable here on Linux. The unfortunate side of things though is that it is still having to do an awful lot on an older system to get a game like this to run. So when you compare it to the Windows side, well, we were seeing pretty much bang on half the frame rate at the exact same time. So our 1% lows, well, they'd drag us down under 30 FPS, and where we were seeing 60 FPS on Windows, well, we were only ever going to be seeing 30 FPS here. When it came to Counter-Strike 2, I did attempt to run both the native version of the game, and I did also try to run the game through Proton. Ultimately, the native version of the game did run better, but that doesn't necessarily mean it runs well, as we saw 18 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 11 FPS. And it's also worth noting here that I didn't have access to the workshop benchmark map that I usually run. So this is actually less intensive than the test that we were doing on Windows, where we were once again seeing a much better frame rate. Now this was a bit of a shame to see, but it is easily explained by the rather poor support of Vulkan this Maxwell graphics card does actually have, and it goes to show that unfortunately Windows is even a better option than a native port in a Valve-produced title. Cyberpunk 2077 is an intensive game, so I could understand that it was always going to struggle on this system, whether it's running on Linux or it's running on Windows. However, there was no reason for us to even benchmark it in-game, because it couldn't even get through the benchmark with a playable frame rate, unlike on Windows where it could. We saw the game running at low settings in 384p with FSR, and averaged around 20 FPS with 1% lows down to 15 FPS. The one redeeming factor I suppose you could say it did have was that we had relatively good frame times throughout the benchmark, but in no way did it make the game playable. I mean, this was also pretty much the case over on Windows, but at least we saw over 30 FPS in the benchmark, and even then we saw better frame rates than this actually going in-game on Windows. So Cyberpunk is a complete write-off on both operating systems, but is noticeably worse here on Linux. BeamNG took an unbelievably long amount of time to load, and it wasn't exactly what I'd call a spectacular experience either once it did. Now, it was playable, and simpler maps would run at anywhere from 40 to 50 FPS with the same set of settings, but during the jungle map benchmark, we saw with low and medium settings in 720p around 28 FPS on average, with rather good frame times with 1% lows down to 24 FPS. Now, the game was fully controllable here and did actually seem really quite smooth once it had loaded everything in, but that was until I reminded myself that back on the Windows side of things, we were still seeing 43 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38 FPS in the exact same instance. So unfortunately, at what first seemed to be a rather positive result, well, the performance just isn't there. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 I didn't hold out a particularly great amount of hope for, given how intensive this game can be, and of course the limited system specifications we have on show. Now, it ran at 22 FPS, with 1% lows down to 7 FPS, with most of the textures struggling to load in, even at the best of times. Now, as I understand it, the conversion calls actually do use quite a lot of VRAM in themselves, and we are of course stuck with DDR3 RAM on our graphics card here, which is of course going to detriment performance, and Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably one of the best examples of how slow it acts when it's having to do it, as I've never seen the game struggle to load in assets this much, and I've tested it on some really rather bad systems. Over on the Windows side of things, we did see the game not exactly run too much better in terms of overall average, but at least we had frame times that meant the game was at least a bit controllable, and it didn't struggle as much loading things in. When it came to things like Tinyglade though, well, there really wasn't much disparity between how the game ran in Linux and how the game runs over on Windows. So I can't exactly fault things here. I mean, you could go lower in resolution apparently here on the Linux side than it does let you in Windows, so technically you could eke out a slightly better frame rate. Either way, for this type of game, not that you really should be playing it at these types of frame rates anyway, or on this type of system, given its forced ray tracing or lumen or whatever it actually is, it does look really rather good and is actually quite controllable. Given the really good frame times we had here though, I'd be willing to eke out and just about say that this was a smoother experience over on Linux, but neither situation's exactly ideal. We're talking frame rates that are in the teens and trying to call it a playable experience regardless of what system you're using. Now, Project Zomboid was a game that I usually quite like testing back on Linux because I'm fairly sure it has its own native port, and I'm fairly sure that's the version that we're running here. In fact, that is the version we're running here because I'm trying to remember I did test it with Proton, and I tested the native port just to see how the performance compared. And it turns out the native port really is the way to go here, with 38 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 27 FPS, all while utilising medium settings in 1080p. The performance disparity between Linux and Windows really didn't matter too much because it would change depending on where you actually are in the game. So at some points they were at parity, on sometimes the Linux side was better, other times the Windows side was better. It does seem that the Windows side dealt with zooming out of the game a little bit easier, but the Project Zomboid experience seemed smoother when you were in smaller, more enclosed environments over on the Linux system. So either way, it does seem that Project Zomboid is pretty much at parity depending on Windows or Linux or what you want to play. Now, Mount & Blade Bannerlord is always the pinnacle of optimization, and here we were at least able to manage the game running with low and medium settings in 1080p, with 32 FPS on average, albeit a couple of bits of stuttering down to 19 FPS, which were present in the large battle benchmark. These would of course be completely non-existent during actual gameplay when you're in smaller battles through the early to mid-game. It's only when you're getting really into the packed late game that you're going to be seeing a few of these stutters. Over on the Windows side of things, we did see a higher average, but overall the frame times were actually worse. So it did feel a bit smoother here on Linux compared to how it did on Windows, just you are going to be seeing a lower average if you're going to be using the Linux side of things on an older system like this. But this was a good one. When running Skyrim Anniversary with high settings in 900p, we saw 48 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 31 FPS. And the best bit here was, this was actually ever so slightly better and ever so slightly smoother than it was over on Windows. And it did actually sort out the frame pacing that made the Windows side feel slightly juddery. So Skyrim Anniversary was a clear win for Linux here. It was just the only time that we saw a clear definitive win. But can it run Crysis ... Warhead, because I don't actually have Crysis on Steam, I only have Crysis Warhead, but it turns out it does actually run really well with the gamer settings in 720p, and I'm not joking, they do actually call it the gamer settings when you actually launch the game. We ran at 48 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 28 FPS, and this is pretty much exactly in line with the same way that we saw the game run over on the Windows side of things. Admittedly, that was just Crysis, not Warhead, so technically Linux is running a slightly more intensive version of the game. So, to make of that what you will, we saw a very similar frame rate, and it's nice to know that Linux can actually deal with Crysis really rather well. So when we actually take the performance we've seen on both Linux and Windows and we compare them game by game, there are certainly some stark differences. When we start with GTA 5 Enhanced or GTA 5 Legacy, we are seeing very much half the performance on average, and this does make sense for a couple of reasons. Namely, for the case of GTA 5 Enhanced, well, this is a DirectX 12 game that is then being converted to Vulkan, which is very poorly understood by the GTX 745 graphics card, leaving the Core i3 to deal with overhead processing, and we end up with the experience we've seen here. GTA 5 Legacy is similar for another reason, but that's because it's DirectX 11 and is a rather heavy game with lots of draw calls going on, and once again we are seeing half the frame rate because our processor is trying to make up for what the graphics card doesn't understand. That's not a complete one-to-one accurate explanation, but it's enough to cover the reason of why we're seeing such a performance deficit. Counter-Strike 2, I am lost on this reason. Apparently the Linux port is actually notoriously troublesome for actually getting you a better overall frame rate than Windows on certain hardware, and this is just hardware that it downright despises. Despite being a native port, we saw absolutely appalling performance. Counter-Strike 2077 once again goes to show that Windows was able to edge out a playable experience, at least in the benchmark, whereas it was unplayable on Linux. Admittedly, frame times were better, but not enough to make it playable. BeamNG, it was a little bit closer than the others have been, but once again, still a clear win for Windows. Red Dead Redemption 2 was the line between playable and unplayable, with Linux actually being a much worse experience when we factor the frame times into it, and Tiny Glade was pretty much one-to-one between Windows or Linux, depending on what you were doing. It was similar with Project Zomboid. Once again, it depended on situation or area, with Windows just about being better overall, and Bannerlord, well, it depends what you want. If you want a higher average frame rate, Windows was better, but Linux was actually the better overall experience. Our one singular win of the day, though, was Skyrim Anniversary, which miraculously ran quite decently better on Linux, and then Crysis, which ran about the same on both systems. So there we have it, and I'm hoping that doesn't seem too disappointing or underwhelming for some people, because, I mean, everyone's seen those videos pop up in their feed, and they've probably had a little gander at watching them and gone, well, if Linux seems to perform so much better, why isn't everyone using it? Well, unfortunately, there is a good subset of hardware that isn't the latest hardware that simply doesn't benefit from running here on Linux. I mean, don't get me wrong, the actual desktop experience did seem slightly smoother than that of running a cut-down version of Windows, and of course you haven't got to worry about needing support or anything like that. There is just support guaranteed for you here on Linux. But when it actually comes to the overall experience of what you can do with your computer, at least in terms of programs and gaming, well, for most instances and most people, you're seeing a 50% cut in the most popular titles. Indie games will tend to run at parity with the Windows version, which was nice to see, but there's some odd outliers like Counter-Strike that are just downright now unplayable because you move to a Linux system. Now, I fully appreciate there are going to be some people that are going to be saying this hardware is simply not designed for Linux and all this, as if I didn't get a ton of comments asking me to test on Linux. It's not that Linux was a bad idea. We can see here it runs absolutely fine and the desktop experience is also absolutely fine. But the issue comes from the fact of these older Nvidia cards have got more or less no Vulkan support. That's why you're better off using DirectX or OpenGL. And when it comes to the native ports, well, if they are now utilizing Vulkan, then you're in the same boat as if you're using DXVK and Proton. This is where the issue lies. There is certainly an age of hardware that does benefit from Linux, but a lot of these older Nvidia and at least Intel parts in these sort of combinations that you come across so commonly, well, it does seem like if you want to do any gaming, unfortunately, Windows is still your best option. Either way, it's been interesting to go down this rabbit hole a little bit, and I certainly have learnt a lot about Linux side testing from this because my knowledge was a tiny bit out of date. But still, I hope this video has been interesting for some of you and at least goes to dispel that myth that you can put Linux on any system and it's going to perform better. Because yes, it will in some cases, but for some hardware, well, you're not going to be seeing that performance increase because you lack the APIs to receive it. So thank you very much for watching, I hope you've all enjoyed, and good night.